On the night of my son's graduation, I found my mom sitting on the service stairs of the auditorium, with her cloth purse on her knees and her navy blue dress, the one she had bought at the downtown market 2 months earlier, the one she had ironed 3 times that week so it would be left without a single wrinkle. My dad was standing next to her, wearing his brown suit jacket, the one he uses for important occasions, looking at his watch without saying anything. Inside, in the reception hall, 180 people were drinking wine and eating canapes on silver trays, while my son's name appeared on a huge screen in golden letters. My parents had been on those stairs for 40 minutes because someone had told them that the front row seats were for immediate family and that they could go in to congratulate him when the protocol ended. When I understood who had given that instruction and why, I walked over to where my son was in his cap and gown and whispered something in his ear. He stared at me, nodded, and together we did something that split that night right in two in front of all the people who mattered in Chicago. But I haven't gotten to that part yet. Before I go on, tell me where you're listening from. I like to know how far these stories reach. And if what we do here resonates with you, hit the bell so you don't miss what's coming. My name is Sarah Miller. I'm 38 years old, and I've been a primary school teacher at Lincoln Elementary on the South Side for 14 years. I teach 4th grade. Fractions, spelling tests, American history, the multiplication tables that kids hate, which I swear to them they'll be grateful for when they grow up. My specialty is the kids nobody listens to because they speak too softly. The ones nobody notices because they sit way in the back. 14 years teaching them that the place others assign them is not the place they belong. That certainty was taught to me by my parents long before I knew how to put it into words. And that same certainty is what I used on the night of November 16th at the McCormick Place Convention Center, when everything I had kept quiet for 13 years stopped fitting inside me. I grew up on the South Side, in a cinder block house without siding that my dad built in pieces as the money allowed. First the living room and the kitchen, then 2 bedrooms, then a bathroom with a tin roof that sounded like a drum when it rained. I liked that sound. I used to fall asleep listening to it as a little girl, thinking someone was playing music outside. My mom used to tell me it was the sky letting us know it was going to water the plants because they needed it. That's how my mom was inventing pretty explanations for things that didn't have one. My dad, Henry Miller, was a bricklayer for 37 years. 37 years mixing cement, carrying rebar, climbing scaffolding, with hands that hadn't bent quite right since he turned 50. He built houses that later sold for millions in gated communities where they wouldn't have even let him walk through the front door. I know this because he told me once, without bitterness, just as a fact, the way he stated difficult things like he was talking about the weather. He only finished grade school, but he could read a construction blueprint better than any fresh-out-of-college architect because he learned a blueprint with his hands before he learned it with his eyes. He retired on a pension that barely covers his blood pressure medication. His shoulders are rolled inward from so much heavy lifting. He's been walking slowly for 5 years now, but when he speaks, people turn to listen because he rarely talks, and when he does, he's right. My mom, Ruth Miller, sewed alterations for 30 years on a secondhand Singer machine she bought with the money she saved selling hot coffee on the corner of the market for 6 months. She sewed at the dining room table because there was nowhere else. Trousers, prom dresses, school uniforms, tablecloths for events. Women from the nice neighborhoods would arrive with fabrics that cost what my mom made in a week, asking her to make something elegant and beautiful for Saturday. My mom would make them something elegant and beautiful by Thursday, because that's who she was, always delivering early, always delivering better than they asked. The sides of her index fingers have calluses from guiding fabric under the presser foot. When she sewed without thinking, she'd hum old folk lullabies she used to sing to my sister and me when we were little. Sometimes I hear her, And remember, there was a time when the world was so small, it fit entirely on that dining room table, with the Singer machine buzzing. Together, they paid for my sister and me to study. My sister studied nursing at the community college. I went to the state teachers' college. My mom kept the tuition bills in a manila envelope with my name written in black marker, tucked inside the fridge behind the milk, because she said no one would look there if we got robbed, and the cold made the money last longer. I don't know if the cold part is true, but that envelope never went missing. I met Richard Sterling at a wedding, a college friend's reception at a country club in Lake Forest. I was 23. I was wearing a green dress I'd bought at Macy's with my very first full teacher's paycheck. It was the first expensive piece of clothing I'd ever bought, and I felt it. Richard was 28. He was an accountant at a logistics firm. He danced well, almost too well for a man who didn't smile while dancing, as if dancing were a serious matter requiring deep concentration. I thought it was funny. I told him he danced like something was hurting him. He laughed. That laugh was the beginning of everything. His family was one of the established families in Chicago. Not the richest, but the kind that had spent 3 generations living in the same wealthy suburb, attending the same church, joining the same country club, operating within the same network of acquaintances. A web nobody sees, but everybody feels. His dad, Ernest Sterling, was the manager of a distribution company his grandfather founded, a bald man with a graying mustache who spoke softly, forcing everyone else to lower their voices to hear him, as if attention were a scarce resource he controlled. His mom, Eleanor Sterling, was the president of the Parish Ladies Committee, a charity event organizer, and the sweetest woman in the world, provided things went exactly the way she had decided they should go. Eleanor wasn't mean with a mean face. She was the kind who said something and made you feel grateful she said it, even though that very thing left a tiny hole in your chest you wouldn't know how to name until years later. The first time I went to their house for dinner, a 2-story place in Winnetka with a garden and a 3-car garage, Eleanor asked me 4 consecutive questions without pausing, like someone filling out a form. Where did I live? On the south side, I told her. She nodded. What did my dad do? Retired bricklayer. She nodded again. What did my mom do? Seamstress. Third nod. Where had I gone to school? State college. Fourth nod. That one was a little slower. When dinner was over, she told me what I had achieved was very admirable, that not just any girl from my circumstances managed to get a degree, that Richard was a good boy, but she hoped I understood that marrying someone also meant marrying their family, and that required a certain adaptation. A certain adaptation. At 23, I took that phrase as well-intentioned advice. At 38, I understand it was a warning dressed up as advice, which is the most dangerous thing in the world, because you can't defend yourself against it without looking rude. Richard told me later that his mom was like that with everyone at first, that deep down, she was really a good person. She just needed time. Always that time. That time that passes without anything ever changing. We got married 2 years later. Eleanor organized almost the entire wedding. I picked my dress and the table flowers. That's what they let me do. My mom wanted to embroider my initials on the handkerchief I was going to carry. Just something tiny, she said, just so you carry something of mine. Eleanor said the handkerchief was part of the dress ensemble, and embroidering it might throw off the aesthetic of the look. My mom folded the thread, put the needle away, and said it was fine, no problem. The important thing was that I was happy. But I watched her hands put that needle away, and I knew something else had been put away with it, and it wasn't just the thread. At 26, I had Matthew, the first Sterling grandchild. Eleanor threw herself into him with an intensity that I found beautiful at first, but over the years, I started to understand differently. She bought him designer clothes, sent him catalog toys, enrolled him in swimming lessons at the club when he was 4. And at the same time, at Sunday dinners, my parents would arrive, say hello, sit wherever there was space, and spend the afternoon watching their grandson from that polite distance nobody named, but everybody knew existed. When Matthew turned 5, Eleanor hired a photographer to make him a birthday album. My parents are in 3 photos. Eleanor and Ernest are in 42. I know because I counted them one Sunday when I stumbled upon the album by accident while looking for something else in the living room bookcase. A teacher counts even when she doesn't want to count. My parents didn't say anything. They got used to it, or they pretended to get used to it, which is a different thing that hurts more because it takes more effort. I didn't say anything either. I gave it time. 13 years of time. What I learned in those 13 years is that time doesn't fix things that someone decided were always going to be crooked. Time just passes. Matthew's birthdays went by where my parents would arrive with handmade gifts and leave them on a side table because the main gifts were already arranged on the center table with color-coordinated bows. The day came when Matthew came home from school, repeating without malice a phrase he had heard at his paternal grandparents' house, that his maternal grandparents were very simple but very hardworking. Said with the exact same tone you use to describe things you appreciate but wouldn't display in your living room. I asked him who told him that. He said Grandma Eleanor, and that she had said it nicely. She had said it nicely. My 8-year-old son couldn't yet know that there are phrases that sound nice and do damage nicely, which is the worst possible combination. I didn't say anything to Richard. Over the years, I learned to file things away in a mental drawer and keep going. My parents had taught me that by accident, to keep going even if it hurts, to not make a scene, to not cause problems. I learned it so well, it took me 13 years to realize that not causing problems isn't the same as not having problems. The problem was there. I had just learned not to look at it. Matthew grew up serious, curious, with my dad's skillful hands and my mom's precision for doing things right the first time. As a boy, he loved going to my parents' house to watch his grandfather mix cement in the yard, because Henry would explain the proportions to him like it was math. He liked sitting next to my mom while she sewed, asking her to teach him straight stitches. My mom taught him. By the time he was 12, Matthew could sew a button better than most adults I know. At 16, he decided he wanted to study civil engineering. He told me in the kitchen one afternoon while we were doing homework together, him with his calculus notebook and me grading tests. "Mom, I want to build bridges. Not highway overpasses. Pedestrian bridges. The ones people cross on foot." Grandpa Henry told me walking bridges are the ones that matter most because they're used by people who don't have cars. I sat there with my pencil in my hand, completely frozen for a moment. My 16-year-old son had understood something that 4 generations of sterling architects and accountants had never grasped. He went to Northwestern University for 5 years. He was the top student in his class for structural engineering. I know this because his advisor told me at a review meeting, and also because Matthew never told me himself, which is another way of knowing. Graduation day arrived November 16th. Matthew woke up quiet, carrying that specific seriousness of his when he cares deeply about something and doesn't want it to show. I made him bacon and eggs for breakfast. My mom showed up at 8 in the morning with a bag of cinnamon rolls from the neighborhood bakery, the one that opens at 6, the one you can smell from down the street. My dad came in right behind her, with his brown suit jacket wrapped in a plastic bag so it wouldn't wrinkle, his blue dotted tie rolled up in his hand. My dad wears that tie for the occasions that matter. He's had it for 20 years. My mom gave it to him for Father's Day with money she saved up by taking on 2 weeks of extra sewing. It's a normal tie, nothing fancy, but my dad knots it with a precision that makes it look like the most important thing in the world. We got to McCormick Place at 5 in the afternoon. The diploma ceremony had been at 3 in the main auditorium, and there was plenty of room for everyone. My parents were sitting right next to me in the center seats. My mom cried when they read Matthew's name out loud. My dad didn't cry. He clenched his jaw and stared straight ahead with that face he gets when he's holding something back that he's not going to let out because we're in public. When we left the auditorium, we took pictures outside by the fountain. Matthew standing between his 4 grandparents in his cap and gown, holding his rolled-up diploma. My parents are smiling in those photos, my mom pulling the tassel on his cap to make sure it was centered, my dad with his hand on Matthew's shoulder, looking at him the way you look at something that cost a lot and finally arrived. Those pictures are in my living room. I put them in a large frame the exact same day I printed them. At the reception hall, an event coordinator named Patricia greeted me, a woman with a professional voice and a catalog smile. I asked her for the head table seating chart, a habit of mine from being a teacher. Before anything important starts, I check that everything is in order. Not out of distrust, out of discipline. She showed me the tablet screen. Matthew in the center, Richard to his right, me to his left. Ernest and Eleanor next to Richard. On my side, an aunt of Richard's I barely knew, and Matthew's godfather, who was Richard's best friend from college. I scanned the chart looking for my parents. They weren't at the head table. They weren't at the second table. I kept looking table by table. Ruth Miller and Henry Miller were nowhere to be found. I asked Patricia. She took a second, the second of someone who doesn't want to say what they have to say. She explained that Mrs. Sterling had called the afternoon before to make a slight adjustment to the layout. She had instructed her that Mrs. Miller's parents, that's exactly how she said it, Mrs. Miller's parents would prefer to sit in the waiting area in the corridor because they would feel more comfortable in a less formal environment. That it was their idea because they weren't used to events of this type. Because they weren't used to it. I laughed, not out of joy. I let out the kind of laugh that escapes when the body doesn't know what else to do with something too massive to process all at once. I told Patricia I needed a moment. I walked out a side door into the service corridor. That hallway that smells of industrial detergent and hot food where the walls don't have the finished look of the main hall because nobody who matters ever walks through there. And there was my mom, sitting on the stairs with her cloth purse on her lap and her navy blue dress, the one she had ironed 3 times. My dad standing next to her, with his brown suit jacket and his blue dotted tie, checking his watch. When they saw me, they both stood up at the same time, like they had been caught doing something they shouldn't. My mom spoke in that soft voice of hers that has no edge, even when it has every right to be sharp. Honey, Mrs. Eleanor said we'd be quieter out here while the protocol finished up, and they'd let us know when we could go in. She said there are a lot of important people inside, and it was just easier for everyone this way. She said it without an ounce of resentment. She said it truly believing it was a considerate gesture. My dad looked at her, not at me, and said, "It's fine, sweetheart. They'll call us in a minute." My dad, 64 years old, his shoulders ruined from 37 years of heavy lifting, wearing his perfectly knotted 20-year-old tie, waiting in a service corridor on the night of his only grandson's graduation, because someone had decided he'd be more comfortable out there. I didn't scream. I've been a teacher for 14 years. 14 years learning that when something spins out of control, the first thing you do isn't react. The first thing you do is understand what happened so you can fix it right. I told them everything was fine, thank you very much, and that in just a moment we were all going into the hall together. My mom smiled. My dad pulled his tie to center it. I went back in the way I came. I leaned against the corridor wall. I needed to feel something solid while my brain sorted things into columns, like when I grade exams and have to separate what can be salvaged from what can't. I looked for Richard. I found him in the hall chatting with two coworkers, holding a drink. I asked him to step outside for a second. He walked out with the expression of someone who doesn't grasp the urgency. I asked him if he knew my parents were waiting in the service corridor, because his mother had decided they'd be more comfortable there. His face dropped. He gave me that sideways, downward glance people do when they get caught in something they can't deny, but don't want to confirm either. He told me his mom had mentioned something that morning, that she thought my parents would feel out of place at the head table with all the university deans and Matthew's classmates and their families. That it was out of consideration. There was no bad intention. Out of consideration. That word that had spent 13 years showing up under different names every time someone decided on behalf of my parents what was best for them without ever asking. I asked him if he had approved it. He said he found out that afternoon, when it was already done, but that he didn't think it was a big deal, because at the end of the day, my parents were there. It wasn't like they weren't invited. They were there, in the corridor, wearing their party clothes and their important occasion shoes, waiting for someone to tell them they were finally allowed inside. I didn't answer him. I walked straight into the hall to find Eleanor. She was at the table of honor with her friends from the ladies' committee, holding her glass of rosé and wearing her event pearls. When she saw me coming, she didn't move from her chair. She just waved her hand for me to come closer slowly, like someone calling over a person who has plenty of time. I asked her point blank if she had given the order to have my parents wait in the corridor. She told me it hadn't been an order. It was a suggestion that Patricia had misunderstood. That she had only pointed out that perhaps my parents would feel more at ease in a less crowded space because they weren't familiar with these types of events. Weren't familiar. Then she dropped the phrase she had spent 13 years saying in a dozen different ways, finally spoken in its entirety. She said, "Sarah, let's be realistic. This is Matthew's graduation from Northwestern. The deans are here, the professors, his classmates from the entire program, and their families. Your parents are very good people. Nobody doubts that. But they themselves know that in certain environments, they feel uncomfortable. Don't put them in a situation they won't be able to handle. It's for their own good." It's for their own good. She was talking about my mom, a woman who taught herself to read French sewing patterns because a client brought her a European fashion magazine, and she decided that if there was work to be had, she was going to learn how to do it. She was talking about my dad, a man who had built with his bare hands the walls of the gated communities that Matthew's college friends called when their parents needed a remodel. This woman was talking about them like they were fragile objects that needed to be protected from themselves. One of her friends lowered her eyes to her glass, another cleared her throat. Eleanor looked at me, waiting for me to nod to agree. She was right that it was for the best. I told her I'm going to get my parents. I turned around. I walked into the main hall. Matthew was standing with a group of friends, still in his gown, diploma in hand, laughing at something. I watched him scan the room looking for his grandparents, and I saw his face do that thing it does when he's processing something that doesn't add up. He knows me too well. He knew something was wrong. He walked over to me before I could reach him. He asked me where his grandparents were. That's what he calls them, the grandparents. No last names, as if that were their full title and they didn't need another one. I said, "They're in the corridor, honey." He looked at me. He didn't ask why. He looked at me for a long time with that deep seriousness he gets when he's doing the math in his head. And he asked, "Why are they in the corridor, Mom?" I didn't answer that. I asked him, "What do you want to do?" Without hesitating, without lowering his voice, he said, "I want them here." I told him, "Then go get them." I didn't give him a script. I didn't tell him what to say. He was 22 years old. He was an engineer, and he was the guest of honor tonight. And if he wanted his grandparents in that room, he could go get them himself. Matthew headed for the corridor. I watched him push through the doors and disappear. I stood right in the center of the room, waiting. Richard came over and asked me what was going on. I told him Matthew had gone to get my parents. He told me there was no need to make a scene. I told him nobody was making a scene, that a grandson was going to get his grandparents to bring them to his graduation. That wasn't a scene, that was the bare minimum. Matthew came back into the hall through the main doors with my mom on his right and my dad on his left. The three of them walking slowly because my dad walks slowly. Matthew had one hand on my mom's arm and the other on my dad's shoulder. When they walked in, the hum of conversation didn't stop. People kept talking, drinking, moving around. But Matthew walked straight to the table of honor and asked the event coordinator for the microphone. The coordinator looked at him. He was the graduate. He handed in the mic. Matthew took a breath, looked around the room. He had his serious voice on, a voice that sounds much more like my dad's than any Sterling I've ever met. He said, "Good evening, everyone. I want to thank my graduating class, my professors, and my family for being here tonight. There's something I need to say before we continue." The volume in the room dropped, bit by bit, like when the lights dim and your eyes take a second to adjust. Eleanor set her glass on the table. Ernest shifted in his chair. Richard looked from my eyes from across the room. I held his gaze. Matthew said I am a civil engineer because two people taught me to understand how things are built. My grandfather Henry explained the proportions of cement to me when I was 6 and told me that a poorly made mix collapses, and what collapses can hurt people. My grandmother Ruth taught me how to sew a button and told me that the important thing about sewing isn't that it looks pretty, but that it holds up. He paused. Tonight, I went looking for them to take my graduation photos, and I found them waiting in a corridor because someone thought they'd be more comfortable out there. I want everyone in this room to know that wasn't right, and I want my grandparents to know that the place they belong tonight is right here, at this table, with me. The silence in the McCormick Place reception hall was the kind of silence that happens when 200 people simultaneously process something they never expected to hear. Eleanor brought a hand to her pearls. Ernest lowered his head very slowly. A university dean sitting at the table of honor gave a single firm nod while looking at Matthew. I walked up to where he was. I took the microphone from him carefully, the way you take something heavy that needs to be held tight. And I told the room that we appreciated their presence, that the evening would continue for anyone who wished to stay, and I apologized to anyone this might have made uncomfortable, because it wasn't my son's intention to make a scene, but to name something that needed to be named. I handed the mic back to the coordinator. I walked over to the table where Richard was standing. I told him quietly that on the car ride home tonight, we were going to have a conversation we should have had many years ago. And depending on how that conversation went, there were going to be choices to make. I didn't give him ultimatums right then. I gave him time to think, the kind of time that actually works. I went to the table of honor with my parents. I asked Patricia, the coordinator, to place 2 chairs next to mine. She set them down without a word with an efficiency I was silently grateful for. My mom sat to my right with her cloth purse on her lap. My dad sat to her left and pulled his tie to center it. That same gesture as always. Matthew sat across from them. They served him dinner. Eleanor stayed at her table and didn't look our way for the rest of the night. Ernest, however, stood up 20 minutes later, walked over to where we were, and held out his hand to my dad. My dad took it. They didn't say anything. Sometimes a handshake says what neither man knows how to say with words. In the car on the way back, Matthew rode shotgun with me, and my parents were in the back. My mom was stroking the sleeve of my dad's jacket the way she does when she's happy and doesn't quite know how to say it. My dad was staring out the window with that face he gets when he's keeping something locked inside so he doesn't let it out in public. Out of nowhere, my mom asked Matthew, "Did you eat enough? It looked like they served you tiny portions." Matthew said, "Yeah, I ate." "Grandma, it was good. My mom said next Sunday I'm making beef stew." Matthew said I'll bring the thyme. My dad said, without turning from the window, I'll bring the dinner rolls. And that was it. Just like that, as if nothing had happened, and at the same time, as if everything had happened. The conversation with Richard that night was long. I'm not going to tell the whole thing because there are parts that belong only to him and me. What I will say is that it was the first time in 13 years we spoke without me shoving things into a mental drawer to avoid causing problems. I told him everything I had stored away. I told him about Matthew's birthday photos, about the handkerchief for my wedding dress, about the trip his parents took Matthew on to San Antonio when he was 10, which my parents weren't invited to because they didn't fit the plans. About the comment made to Matthew that my parents were very simple but very hardworking, delivered in that tone reserved for things admired from afar. Richard listened. He didn't defend himself. That told me more than anything else he could have said. In the end, he told me I was right, that he had seen things and stayed quiet because it was easier, and that he had no excuse for that. I told him I knew, and that what mattered now wasn't what had happened, but what was going to happen. I asked him if he was willing to have a conversation with his mother, a real conversation, not a polite one where he told her that things were going to be different from now on. He said yes. I don't know if he said it truly believing it, or just wanting to believe it, which is different, but he said it. And sometimes the first step is just saying it, even if you don't know how to do it yet. That conversation with Eleanor happened a week later. I wasn't there. Richard went alone. He told me his mother listened without interrupting, which was already a departure from the usual. In the end, she told him she never had any intention of hurting anyone, and if that's what happened, she was sorry. It wasn't a full-throated apology. It was the closest thing to an apology Eleanor could ever manage. And Richard relayed it to me just like that, without dressing it up. I told him I heard him. Eleanor didn't change her personality overnight. People like her don't change like that. But something shifted after that night at McCormick Place. Something I can't name exactly, but you can feel it in the way she now greets my parents first when we arrive at her house, before moving on to the other hellos. It's small, but it's different from what was there before. Ernest called me a month later. He said he wanted to apologize to me directly, no middlemen. He told me he had been present for 13 years and stayed quiet because that's just how things were in his house, and it never occurred to him that things could be any other way. He said it was no excuse, but he wanted me to know. I thanked him. I told him the past was written, and what mattered was what came next. He asked if Matthew could come visit them. I told him that was a question he had to ask Matthew. Matthew went. He came back saying Grandpa Ernest had asked about his thesis projects and sat there listening to him talk about pedestrian bridges for 40 minutes without interrupting. He said it like it was a remarkable thing. For him, it was. I'm still a teacher at Lincoln Elementary. I still teach 4th grade, fractions, spelling tests, multiplication tables. Matthew is doing his residency at a construction firm in Chicago, and on weekends he goes to see my parents. My dad is teaching him how to read blueprints by hand, without a computer, because he says If you don't know how to read a blueprint by hand, you don't really understand what you're looking at on a screen. Matthew takes a notebook to those visits and writes everything down. My mom watches them from the kitchen and sometimes sends me a picture on WhatsApp. Just the photo, no text. Just an image of the two of them at the table with the blueprint spread out and my dad's hands pointing at something. That's all I need to know. Sometimes I think, what would have happened if I hadn't asked Patricia for that seating chart that night? If I had just stayed in the hall, assuming my parents were settled somewhere. If I had danced and toasted and clapped and sent pretty pictures that night, and my parents had left McCormick Place in silence, in their good clothes and their important occasion shoes, without anyone ever telling them their place was exactly where it had always been, next to their grandson, at the table that mattered. That parallel universe Sarah would have kept carrying a tiny weight in her chest that only gets heavier with the years. There would have been Matthew's wedding someday, and a baptism, and another graduation. And at every single one, my parents would have been pushed a little further to the back, a little less visible in the photos. And nobody would have said anything, because that's just how things were. Things are just how they are until someone says no. I learned that night. And I learned it from my son, who is 22 years old and already knows what took me 13 years to figure out. That people's place isn't decided by whoever organizes the event. It's decided by who loves them. I'm not telling you this so anyone goes out and does what I did. Every family is its own universe. Every story has its reasons, its fears, its complications that you can't see from the outside. I'm telling you this because I know someone is listening right now who has their mom waiting in a hallway in her good dress. Someone who has their dad checking his watch outside a hall while his grandson is being celebrated inside. Someone who has spent years hearing phrases like, "They'll feel more comfortable. It's for their own good. They prefer it this way." It is not for their own good. It is never for their own good. It's for the good of the person deciding who gets in and who stays out. My mom made beef stew the following Sunday. Matthew brought the thyme, just like he promised. My dad walked in with fresh dinner rolls from the market and sat in his usual spot at the kitchen table. My mom served us in 4 mismatched bowls. My dad's was huge. Matthew's was medium, hers was small, and mine was the same size it's always been. We ate together under the yellow kitchen light with the Singer machine buzzing in the corner and the smell of roasted meat filling the house. Matthew went back for seconds. My dad said my mom's stew was the best in the world, just like he says every Sunday for the last 40 years. My mom told him not to exaggerate. My dad said he wasn't exaggerating. And somewhere in the middle of that same old argument, with my spoon in my hand, in the steam from the bowl hitting my face, I realized that this was exactly what we had gone looking for that night at McCormick Place, without even knowing we were looking for it. Not public justice, not the speech, not the stunned silence of the room. This. The table where everyone fits, the yellow light, the same old stew, and absolutely nobody telling you that you don't belong. If this story touched something inside you, subscribe and tell me in the comments which part hit you the hardest. If you also have a mom or a dad who deserved a seat at the table but was left standing in a hallway, write it down. We read every single message here. And if you want more stories like this, hit the bell. I'll be waiting for you. One quick note before we say goodbye. This story was created and dramatized with the help of artificial intelligence, meant to entertain you and leave you with something real to take home. But the feelings it talks about are real, and the people waiting in corridors in their Sunday best are real too. This is for them. The place of the people we love isn't determined by who sets the tables or who prints the seating charts. It's determined by who loves them. Sarah took 13 years to say it out loud, but when she did, she said it with absolute clarity. If you have someone waiting in a hallway right now in their good clothes, there's still time to go get them. A little note for you. This story was built and dramatized with the help of artificial intelligence, with the purpose of entertaining you and leaving you with something true to take home. Because even if the story is fiction, the love it describes is not. M.